Thanks very much. You're much too kind, and I want to just insist that that guy sounds really interesting, but none of this was ever proven. Okay, so tonight it is an honor and it's a pleasure to talk to you. I can't think of an audience that I'd rather tell this story to, even though a lot of it is anthropology, but the question is how it will connect with the things that you care about. So my story is I've been working for the last couple of years for my Balinese friends and colleagues. As Michael said, I've been doing anthropology there for more years than I would like to count. And we've just been creating a UNESCO World Heritage Cultural Landscape in Bali. I can claim the credit for writing the 5th and finally successful proposal to UNESCO to get this thing going. Okay, oh, thank you. Well, the Balinese, however, created the island and the culture, so I'm just their scribe, right? But the thing is, it's in some ways like an LTER, in the sense that it consists of lakes and pristine forests and about 20 villages. Balinese regard it as a sacred landscape, and they care very deeply about it, but it is also massively threatened by globalization. So we sort of seized on UNESCO as a way to maybe make it possible to survive. And in order to do that, it's going to be necessary to explain to the world why the Balinese care about this and what it means to them. So that's what I'm going to try to do tonight for the first time. So I look forward to your comments afterwards. Tell me how to sharpen this thing up. Okay, so off we go. I'll start with a question that we've already been talking about here, which is the relationship between natural systems and social ecological systems, right? So in the last 15 years or so, we've learned in ecology, I'm going to claim part membership in the fraternity of ecologists. We've learned that tipping points are common right across nature, right? I mean, across scales from savannas and coral reefs to probably planetary scale tipping points. But those are to be expected rather than, in other words, the old equilibrium assumptions we've had to set aside. The question is, do they also occur in social ecological systems? And rice paddies are an interesting place to look at because they are very tightly coupled. Human beings create them, and yet they are also natural systems. So let me just refresh your memory on what a tipping point is. I think the most famous example is Martin Scheffer's studies of the ecology of shallow lakes. So Martin's question was, so we got these Dutch lakes and fertilizer flows into them, and the result is they go from clear to turbid. So if this were a linear system, then by reducing the fertilizer, the lakes ought to clear up, but they didn't. So what was going on? He hypothesized that this might be a bifurcation, that there might be a nonlinearity in the system. And he tested it and discovered that if you take the fish out, then the zooplankton can recover, the settlement settles to the bottom. After that, you can reduce the fertilizer, and at that point, the lake will clear up. And he's very celebrated in the Netherlands for having figured this out because damned if it didn't work. Okay, so that's a great story, and we've found similar dynamics in other systems. But lakes are pretty simple. Okay, we're entitled to say that compared to rice paddies. So what about that? Those are rice terraces on the island of Bali, maybe about 1,000 years old. I guess, can you see, well, maybe the next picture. These are rice terraces too. Okay? So they appear and disappear. Farmers create them. And they can also fall apart on a time scale of days, and yet they persist for centuries. So question is, where are the attractors in that system, right? Are there tipping points in this system? Where are they different from the lakes? What's going on here besides biochemistry in this tightly coupled social ecological system created by the farmers? So that's the story. Off we go to Bali. You know where it is. That's what it looks like. About 100 miles by about 90 miles north-south. So it's a pretty tiny place. In 1975, 76. The Green Revolution. You're going to see some videos. The Green Revolution means the introduction of Western farming techniques, basically. It's high-yielding plants that are designed to grow quickly, along with chemical fertilizers and pesticides. So this came as a package to the Balinese farmers. The farmers were told, in the interests of national development, take this new rice and plant just as fast as you can. If you can get 3 crops a year, great. Some of the old people said, well, the trouble with that is, according to our traditional system, we schedule, we carefully time when the water goes into the fields and when it doesn't, and there are reasons for that.
After a couple of years of bumper harvests, those reasons started to become clear. Stephen Lansing's old friend, Wayan Paga, is a farmer in Sebatu. He remembers what it was like 20 years ago when the pests began to appear.
Waktu sekitar tahun 80 kan tuh udah ulang lagi.
The Green Revolution remedy for pests was pesticides.
Memang anjuran dari
It's not just that the farmers were advised to use pesticides, they were forced to use pesticides. They would be punished by the government if they didn't, because the government would say if anybody doesn't use pesticides immediately, as soon as any sign of pests appear, then the pest will spread to other fields. So within a year or two, even the farmers, pumping these pesticides into their fields couldn't kill all the pests. The government then began to fly the island, dropping pesticides from airplanes, and they succeeded in killing damn near everything.
Itu kepercayaan tetap kepada fungsinya kepada Sang Pencipta, karena segala yang hidup itu ditentukan oleh Sang Pencipta.
He says that everything is made by a creator, and so by disturbing anything, by killing anything, you're disturbing part of the creation. So you need to pay attention to the whole picture. Essentially, he's saying you have to pay attention to the whole picture.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that, Stephen told me, was the role of the water temple. Looking at the whole picture, applying wisdom accumulated over centuries.
In the middle courtyard of the temple, the farmers gather every month. They make decisions in a democratic assembly on how they're going to plant. So that's the water temple, and the organization of farmers who are meeting there are called subak. And all the villages that have rice terraces also have subaks, but it's not the same as the village because the subak consists of all the people who share water from the same source. So they cooperate. There's my little pointer here. So there's our village, right? Village A, and there's our water coming down from that weir. And there's village B, so we share that flow, right? And how much water gets to our weir also may depend in part on how much water is released from the cropping pattern of our neighbors upstream in C, right? So the water temples provide a way in which they can coordinate their irrigation schedules. Basic point is that when you start flooding the paddies, the beginning of the cropping cycle, they need the most water because you're flooding the paddy, and then as time goes on, the amount of water goes down. So there's a need for cooperation. They all coordinate their own cropping system, but they also work with their neighbors, and that's a network, okay? And networks can have emergent properties, and that's what you're going to see. This is it's a good example, actually. It's a sort of standard. This is a talk, that part of the talk I've given before. At Santa Fe Institute, you want an example of a real-life complex adaptive system. You're about to see one. Okay, so that's the question is, how does this system work, and how can it be preserved, and what's the tipping point? And what the Balinese are now trying to do is to create a World Heritage to help maintain the water temples because they were nearly destroyed by the effects of the Green Revolution. So that's my story. The name for our World Heritage is Trihitakarana, and that's what this is. Trihitakarana, the three causes of the good or something like that. They believe that in order to understand what they are trying to do, you need to realize that it's not just about nature, it's also about the connection between nature and humanity, and then human connections with, you can call it gods, but really it's idea, spirit, something like that. So as this talk goes on, you'll probably get a better idea of what the Balinese say when this interaction is what makes their system work. Okay, so this is an illustration for our visitor gateway to the World Heritage, just built by Julia Watson. I want to just congratulate her in case this thing goes on the web. Nice work, Julia. I'm really proud of this diagram. Anyway, that's Sri Chakarana. That's the cropping cycle. There are the sequences of rituals that occur to time it, which are organized by the water temple. There's the flow of water, and here's what so that's what you can see in the visible world, but they think in the invisible world, these interactive dynamics are happening, and the one that's key is that one. However, we're going to start here. We're ecologists, so we're going to start right here with nature. So, beginning with nature, right? Bali happens to be just a couple degrees south of the equator in an active volcanic belt, and that volcanic rock, this is rich in mineral nutrients that the plants like phosphate. So here's Bali with quite a lot of phosphate in the volcanic rock, and as the monsoon rains fall on that volcanic landscape, and they pick up minute quantities of the mineral nutrients, and they flow into the irrigation system. So here we have the irrigation flow with the phosphate going in as the weeks go by, and here, after the planting, big pulse, and then it goes down. So this is the phosphate removed by the rice plants after planting. It's a perpetual delivery system for phosphate, potassium, basically everything except nitrogen, which is why the Balinese have been able to grow rice on their paddies year after year since, in some cases, since the 11th century. Okay, so then the water gets to the rice paddies, which are artificial ponds, right? And it's the fertility of that pond aquaculture that makes the rice grow. You get nitrogen-fixing algae, the cyanobacteria, which produces the nitrogen, or fixes the nitrogen, which is why they did not traditionally have to add fertilizer. To make all that work, you have to control the water. There are inscriptions in Balinese 896 AD referring to Undagi Aunan, irrigation tunnel builders. And there are still irrigation tunnel builders in Bali who use hand tools to create tunnels that in some cases go more than half a kilometer through the volcanic rock, creating these tunnels, and then down the water goes to the summit of some terraced hillside downstream. That's how it works. Notice how fragile this thing is. You have to depend on the goodwill of your upstream neighbors, or the system doesn't work. Okay? So it requires cooperation. However, as those monsoon rains fall down that steep volcanic slope, because they've got that volcanic pumice in them, they develop a kind of a cutting edge, and they slice channels down through the slopes of the volcanoes. So the problem for the farmers is the water is found not on the surface, but rather deep in a ravine like this, deep in a channel, and the problem is how do you get that to the downstream terraces, and the answer is you dig these tunnels. So the island by now, after 1,000 years of this, is just honeycombed with aqueducts and tunnels and canals, creating a downstream dependency, right, on the farmers to make sure the water, it's a very small-scale system, getting the water where it needs to go. Once the water reaches the terraces, then you have your subak. So up here we have the terraces, and here's a simple water temple. All of the farmers who obtain water and share the land here belong to the subak, and they meet in their water temple to decide on the cropping schedule, what they're going to do, how they practically manage the fields, and also to give thanks to the deities who are connected with the fertility of the land. Their religion is a blend of Hinduism, Buddhism, and earlier beliefs, Austronesian ideas, but it's kind of a uniquely Balinese religion, which they call the religion of holy water, actually. It's a religion of water. Within those subaks, most of the time, if you speak Balinese, you ask someone, what is your caste? And depending upon which caste, who's got the higher caste, if you are a higher caste than I will speak high Balinese to you, and you will respond in low Balinese. About 2,000 words of core vocabulary vary in this way, so it just instantly locks you into a hierarchical relationship. It's more hierarchical than most academic departments. Okay? It's like that. It's that bad. But in the subak meetings, you have to, by law, by the laws of the subaks, you set that aside and you speak to everybody by agreement, either in high or low language. But this up and down stuff doesn't go on in those meetings. Step outside the meeting and it's back to high and low and who's on top. But it is an enforced kind of egalitarian system, and the language tells you instantly that that's going on. Okay, so now sort of macroscopically, near the center of the island, there are several volcanic crater lakes. This is the largest. This is called Mount Batur. And within that crater lake, they believe there's a goddess, the goddess of the lakes. They think of that lake as a freshwater ocean, which is the source of everybody's water. Right? It's up there in the clouds. You're in Bali looking up. Up there is a lake in that volcanic crater. And upon that lake depends our livelihood if we're rice farmers. One more video clip as to how this works. Oh, wait, okay, well, no, I'm sorry. We'll get to the video clip. There are, naturally, priests who gather water from springs located around the lake. The idea is if your farms are in the north end of the island, then your water will come from the spring that's in the north end of the lake. But the lake itself contains water for everyone. It's sort of a symbol of the whole community of people, of humanity brought together by that gift of the goddess.
The Balinese call their religion Agama Tirta, the religion of water. Each village temple controls the water that flows into nearby rice terraces. Regional water temples control the flow into larger areas.
10 subaks.
High up on the volcano Mount Batur, there is an enormous crater lake. The Balinese believe the lake is the home of the goddess of the waters, Dewi Danu, who makes the waters flow into the rivers and irrigation canals. The supreme water temple of Bali sits on the rim of the crater overlooking the lake. Once a year, priests give holy water from the lake to the farmers as a blessing from the goddess. First, priests ascend the crater to collect drops of water from the steam of the active volcano.
The zenith of a mandala.
Then the priests prepare the holy water for the farmers. A temple scribe writes letters on palm leaves inviting farmers to the temple. Delegations from over 200 villages journey up the mountain to bring offerings to the goddess. At the Supreme Water Temple, the gamelan orchestra plays in honor of the goddess and the worshippers. Temple priests give a sujang, a bamboo container filled with holy water, to each village delegate. The delegations then carry the holy water to their regional temples.
So these are the heads of 10 subaks. And there they all are.
Here, the water from the goddess is mixed with more holy water, adding the blessings of local gods and goddesses. Each delegate receives a sujang of this water to take back to his village.
And now to 1 subak.
At the village temples, local farmers receive a blessing for themselves and their fields. A few drops of holy water are sprinkled on every field. This ritual symbolizes the sharing of water that forms a coordinated system of irrigation in Bali. Working together in this way, the Balinese have maintained the ecology of their rice terraces for over 1,000 years.
All right, so this is the sort of thing we think we'll put in the visitor gateways. Anyway, so water also can be used to control rice pests. Rice is vulnerable to other things that like to eat it besides humans, rats, insects, bacterial and viral diseases carried by the bugs. But by synchronizing their harvest, so they all harvest at the same time, you can deprive the pests of their food and their habitat. So nothing there for the pests to eat. After harvest, how's the sound? Is it going in and out? Sound is okay? Okay, so those fields, a few months ago full of rice and maybe a few pests, but now after harvest it's flooded and there goes the habitat for the pests. And if you really have lots of pests, then you can do this, right? That will take care of the problem by controlling the water. However, it only works if all of the farmers plant on schedule, a tightly controlled schedule, creating a problem of labor bottlenecks. This requires very tight synchronization, which happens through the water temple network. Otherwise, the pests just migrate, right? The size of the area that has to go fallow at the same time depends upon the migration powers of whatever pests you happen to be dealing with at the moment. Otherwise, if we're out of sync, then the pests from my field after I harvest will just move into yours and eat your harvest, okay? So trying to grasp the dynamics of this, we created a simple game which is unlike any other game theoretical game you've seen, because here the environment consists not of the other players, but of the natural environment. Otherwise, it's very simple. So here's the game, upstream and downstream farmers. The upstream farmer they get a choice. They can either synchronize their irrigation, plant at the same time, or not. The upstream guy has his hand on the spigot. He controls the water, so he gets to decide, right, whether they will synchronize or not. So according to this game, upstream farmer says, okay, I'm upstream. I will synchronize, giving up some extra water that I could otherwise use. Downstream farmer says, thank you. And then the pests are under control because they will both harvest at the same time, right? Alternatively, the upstream farmer has the option of keeping all the water and not synchronizing, planting at whatever time he likes, but then my pests might come and eat his fields. Okay, that's the game. Does it bear any resemblance to how Balinese farmers think about it? So we asked them. We asked 150 farmers in 10 subaks, which is worse, pests or water shortages? And we kept track of whether they are an upstream farmer or a downstream farmer. Okay? So here are the results. Upstream farmers worry about pests. Downstream farmers worry about water. So we were happy with that. And then we could also aggregate those results because among the 10 subaks, in 6 cases we had an upstream-downstream pair. So we could say just in general, is the upstream subak more worried about pests than the downstream subak? And voila. So we thought, okay, this does seem to capture something of the dynamics of how the farmers are actually thinking about this pest-water trade-off, which indeed is vital to making the system work. Okay, the only problem with that is that it's unrealistic because, in fact, there are dozens of subaks along a typical water course. They're tightly packed next to each other, and so the bugs in the water, the cropping patterns will influence water and pest flows in the vicinity, and they're highly interconnected. So the question is, how do they get it right? Right? How do they solve that problem at the larger scale? So some years ago, my good friend Jim Kramer, a coastal marine ecologist, came to Bali, and we built a model. So the model goes like this. Here are two rivers, the little black lines of the rivers. The little squares are the subaks, and those little odd things are meant to be water temples. So you can see there are a lot of subaks along that river course, and that how much water that guy gets or that guy gets depends on many decisions happening upstream, let alone the pests, right? So it's quite complicated. So we built a model in which we just simulated annual rainfall. Rainfall happens, rivers flow, irrigation goes in, rice grows, and bugs move around. At the end of that sequence, we tally the harvests. Okay? And then we then vary the spatial scale of coordination to see what's the optimal scale to achieve the best balance between water sharing and pest control. Obviously, if they all plant at the same time, then they'll have no problem with pests, but they'll run out of water. If they all plant at different times, they'll take care of the pests. But, if they all plant at different times, the pests will murder them, but there'll be plenty of water. So that's the trade-off. What's the right scale? And the answer, not surprising maybe, is that the scale, the spatial patchiness of the water temple networks optimizes the trade-off and thus the harvest yields for this whole system. So I gave that talk at Santa Fe Institute some years ago, and that's when the talk ended in those days. And I asked for questions, and Walter Fontana, who's a physical chemist, said, yes, I do have a question. You told me that they've been at this for 1,000 years, so it's probably not surprising they figured out how to get it right. Tell me, did someone have to design this system, or would it self-organize? And I didn't know what he meant. Those were the early days, right? But then I learned what a hill climber is. So we built a hill climber to find out if it would self-organize. Hill climber works just like the model I described. It's the same model except for about 8 lines of code, which does the following. The computer chooses a random assortment of cropping patterns. So like a downward triangle maybe means plant rice in January and October, and star means plant it, some other just randomized cropping pattern. Everybody gets a cropping pattern. Then we just simulate another year of plants and water and pests moving around. But then at the end of that time, everybody gets a harvest, and then you check, each subak checks its 4 immediate neighbors to see if any of them did better. If they did better, copy their cropping pattern. If yours was the best, stick with it, and everybody's made that decision, then we run it again. Okay? So this is a hill climbing thing to see, can they find anything other than chaos? Jim was convinced this would just create chaos, but we persevered. Here's what happens. Here's year 1, randomized cropping schedule. Lots of pests. See, it's random. Those little, right? It's random. So the average harvest is about 5 tons. Not so good. By year 10, those strange little patches have turned into clear aggregates, right? These guys are all doing the same thing, and the average harvest has nearly doubled. Nothing's changed except the synchronization of the harvests at those scales. That is enough to both control the pests and provide water for everybody. And this is finally the actual pattern of water temples. So darned if we didn't grow water temple networks, okay? And so that was interesting, and we thought, okay, well, let's perturb it, right? Let's give them bad years of pests, bad years of water, basically vary the ecological dynamics and see what will happen. And the answer is, it'll always create a water temple network. The particular patchiness depends upon the dynamics of the pest-water trade-off. Okay, so interesting point for the behavioral ecologists in the audience. Okay, not only does everybody's yield go up, but they all pretty soon, by about 5 years, are not only doing very well, but doing equally well. So there's no disparity of benefits. You ask the farmers, how well are you doing compared to the other farmers? And well, we're doing the same, which farmers usually won't tell you, right? But in this case, it's obvious. They are actually all doing very well. There's no disparity of benefits, thus no reason to be jealous. Okay. I'll end with this with respect to that model. The thing that does actually govern these dynamics is the comparison group. So this is who do you check with before you decide which cropping pattern to adopt in the next year? The comparison group. So call that K. In the analysis I just gave you, it was 4 immediate neighbors, but suppose it were 3. Okay, so here's how many subaks change their strategy, their cropping pattern, each year as time goes forward. You can see K equals 3 after about 10 years. Roughly 2/3 of them have found an optimum, a local optimum. They've stopped changing. It means they're in good shape. The rest of these guys are not. They're still swapping back and forth because they haven't found the solution yet. But if we expand the search space to K equals 4, then this many more guys will find a local optimum, and it happens faster. If we extend it to K equals 5, it happens even faster. By the time we get to K equals 13, everybody can look out far enough and find a solution, and so very rapidly the system will self-organize. However, if instead of checking the local neighborhood, they choose comparison from anywhere else in the system, for example, the 4 best cropping patterns anywhere, it is a recipe for chaos. They keep changing constantly. They never find the local optimum. That disrupts the self-organizing dynamics. It's called the experimental farm. Okay, so networks form. They approach this global optimum. And in effect, that is a single attractor. It's an attractor for a spatial dynamics, which is the attractor based upon these pest-water dynamics. And it looks like that. It's what the goddess had in mind, right? Okay? Here she is. There's the goddess, and there's her attractor. She can make it good for everybody. However, she needs cooperation. He, by the way, is an irrigation tunnel builder, figuring out where it's going to go, okay? So this ecological attractor triggers social dynamics, okay? Next slide. So we did a survey here. Here are 4 subaks, different river. Turns out they vary in how good they are at cooperating. This whole system depends upon effective cooperation. So we asked a quick little survey, the farmers in these 8 subaks, how good is your subak at cooperating? How good are you at fixing technical problems? How effective are the sanctions in your subak, etc.? Just, how well does it work on the dimensions of the effectiveness of cooperation? And what we found is this is the question, which is better? Trying to translate it from the, how effective is your subak in managing its world, right? So the upstream guys are really much better off than the downstream guys. So we wondered about that. Could they possibly be in different regimes? Okay, so here's the answer to the question, how effective are the sanctions in my subak? Do you remember Dominique Strauss-Kahn? Okay, I'll say no more. But here are the upstream guys. As far as they're concerned, their sanctions work just fine. The lower farmers in the lower 4 subaks, you with me? Think things are fine, but basically the average score is much lower. And in fact, that was true of everything that we asked. It didn't matter. We asked questions about, for example, the importance of class differences. Subaks vary in the proportion of their members who are owners versus sharecroppers. But those dynamics play out differently in the lower versus the upstream subaks. We asked about caste. How important are caste disparities in the management of your subak? Same result. So in general, cutting to the chase here we have the dynamics for the upstream subaks. These are the guys who think everything's fine. These are just, here are 11 social variables. How effective is my subak at performing rituals, for example? That's one of them. So these, if you don't know this plot, most of the ecologists in the audience will. Anything outside that circle is significant. Well, I'm not going to go through the details of this anyway, so let's just cut to the chase here. Here's the pattern of correlations for the lower subaks, and what you can see is the dynamics work very differently, right? The pattern of correlations with respect to the effects of caste, class, ownership, ritual, all those things just interact very differently in those two cases. And that's all you need to take away from this picture to say, well, these really look different. So if we were going with standard equilibrium assumptions, if we thought this was a linear system, if we assumed that the proportion of sharecroppers will always have more or less the same effect, then we'd miss that dynamic. See, what we've done here is to say, here are two dynamics that govern relationships that are starkly contrasting in these two different groups of subaks. Okay? So another example, we asked them to play the dictator game. In the dictator game, I give you a day's wage, and you and the other guys and the other farmers are seated around, and we say, okay, we're going to allow you to anonymously give as much or as little of this as you will to another member of your subak. And then the game's over. World's simplest game. Okay? So here's the game offers for the lower subaks, 20% of the day's wage up to 35 or so, correlated with the subak condition. What shape is my subak in? Overall statistic, how good is my subak? So notice here, the worse the condition of my subak, the less I give. These guys are kind of giving up. Now here are the upstream subaks. Okay, their condition is much better. And in general, they are more generous. The most generous of all is the subak that's in the worst shape. Think about that for a minute. So it's the opposite of giving up. This is a subak that has been having problems with irrigation. They're redoubling their pro-social behavior, right? They are exceptionally generous. These are opposite patterns. But if we did not pay attention to this, I'm positing two regimes here, if we just averaged over the whole system, then it would just look like a kind of a noisy pattern. We'd lose that dynamic, right? Those dynamics are visible only because we're looking at these two patches. Finally, PCA. This is a little fancier than a PCA. So here we have a principal component analysis showing that we can did I say in the last slide maybe? We can account for almost all the variance in these principal components, right? First two. We just reduce the dimensionality from 11 to 2 dimensions, and we get like 95% of the variances explained for the upstream subaks. Okay, so now we're looking at those dynamics. We reconstruct the basin of attraction for these two systems. These are the happy subaks. These are the upstream subaks. They're close to perfection. They're in a rather deep well. We've shifted to using a physics technique, which would take me a long time to explain, so I'll just say this is in a deep well. In a sense, this is just the basin of attraction for this group. That's the basin of attraction for the other guys. The lower subaks, I'm claiming they're sort of muddling through. Things are not perfect, but they manage to survive. These guys are in very good shape, and we can then calculate the transition path using this physics metaphor. It's the instanton path method, if you're interested. So using that method, we could say, well, what is the transition? What's the most likely transition path to get between these two? And what dominates that? And the answer is the effectiveness of sanctions. That's the dominant variable governing the transition between those two states. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and except to say it's significant at 4 sigma. Something really different about those two regimes. Okay? That's the minimum energy pathway between them. So, attractors emerge for these social dynamics within the subaks. The idea is, first of all, the pest-water dynamics set up a single attractor for the spatial patterning, the pest-water cooperation network between subaks for the whole system. Once that's in place and there are really strong motives for cooperating and following that pathway, then you have the problem of the subaks actually doing it, and there we see empirically 2 attractors for either nailing it or muddling through. Okay? Actually, there's a third possibility. Failure is an option. They lose about 1,000 hectares of rice terraces per year now, which is why there's a crisis. Okay, so that brings us to the water temples. Akasa. And we're back to Trihita Karana. So it's this dynamic. Okay? How do they actually make this work? There are 2 major, Balinese religion is rather complicated, but the very quick version is one set of beliefs and rituals have to do with male powers. The word for this is purusa, High Balinese word for penis. It comes down through the caste system and it empowers you. The other is pradana. It's female, and farmers perform female pradana rituals. What they have to do with is not ancestral power of my caste line, but rather the fostering of control of the self in the outer world. They also believe that everything that exists in the inner world exists in the outer world, in and out, microcosm, macrocosm, wana lit, wana agun. Anyway, so the control of the self is the basis for control of the outer world. They think that everybody's emotions are the same. They're kind of Jungian. I have krodha, is anger that lives here in me, and maybe in you. Okay? So it's the recognition of those things that allows people to achieve a level of focused concentration that they think makes these wheels turn. And rituals are the way in which they align those elements of the inner world in the hope that it will also align the outer world. They believe that in the end there are 102 elements of both inner and outer world, and at the end of the harvest, you collect those things which grew in your field and array them or align them in this order, which is the same as the order in you, and then dedicate them in the water temple to the goddesses and gods, depicting them in perfect order, relating simultaneously to you and to those things which sustain you, which came from nature. This is another clip. Beyond functionalism. So these are offerings of things that grew in that canal, or grew from the water of that canal. Water temple offerings, ritual offerings.
Tapi manusia ulung pribadi yang betara niki yang ene ayaban kan yang ke manusia janganan sambutan. High priest, he's aligning those worlds with these mudras. They say that if you look at these terraces flooded at night in the moonlight, they look like a diamond, they look like a jewel, Manik, and you too look like a jewel if everything's in balance. And those two facts are not unrelated. Okay? So that's your quick tour of Balinese religion. Yes. Oh, and a little bit more. So from they connect in this way colors, music, sounds, emotions,
in a pattern which must be created. That's what the ritual offerings are about. If you visit Bali, you'll see they devote a great deal of time to making these beautiful offerings. And this is why. This is my quick explanation as to why they do that. There's a more elaborate one of the universe. Okay, so finally, when you die, here's a burial shroud for a farmer showing how those components of the self are now returning to the world. And here's the burial shroud for a Brahmin priest who's devoted the last half of his life to achieving a higher level of concentration. You'll notice that his inner world is simpler, more universal. So, in brief, control of the self is thought to be what water temples are really about. When I started videotaping them and asking them questions, I was perplexed because they were forever talking about ritual and things like this rather than managing the water. And they finally said, well, you know, we know how to manage the water. This is what's complicated. Getting people to the high levels of cooperation that are required to make this work, that's the hard part. Okay, so that's sort of the quick tour of Bali now. Come the 1970s, Green Revolution comes to Bali. For the best of reasons, Indonesia was importing rice. It was a very poor country. They needed to increase agricultural productivity. There are no villains in this story, but it meant that a massive change occurred in the ecology of the Balinese. Balinese were told, they were given technology packets. I'm coming to the end of this story. So a technology packet consists of rice, seeds, fertilizer, pesticides. You don't pay for it. Instead, it's delivered to you in your village. And after you've grown the crops, you then sell them back to the government, deducting the costs of the inputs that they gave you. Right? Those are the technology packets. Within a few years, and the farmers were told to plant rice as fast as possible, set aside the water temples. You may continue with your quaint beliefs, but we need to grow more rice. That was the story. Okay, so everybody plant as often as possible and not coordinating the water temples. So now you can guess what happened, right? Or you can simulate it. Just run our simulation model backwards. By running our simulation model backwards, you disaggregate the water temple network and you get explosions, and I'm quoting now, explosions of pests and chaos in the irrigation system, because that's what was reported to the Asian Development Bank, and it was regarded as unfortunate. I mean, noise. It was basically noise. It was not meaningful.
Once the government understood.
Oh, wait, before I show this clip. However, it was not difficult to show the final evaluation team from the Asian Bank that there really are water temples to explain all this, at which point they changed their mind and decided that actually the water temple system is very important. We made a film and they show it, okay, in Manila. So the water temple, the idea that water temple networks play a vital role in coordination, in fact, do better than any other system we know about, is accepted. However, there's still a problem. Okay, the water temple solution is not the whole story.
Once the government understood this, they allowed the water temples to regain control. But the Green Revolution still lingers. To this day, farmers add chemical fertilizer to this ancient, self-sustaining system.
For the last 30 years, the farmers have been borrowing money from the village cooperatives to buy fertilizer that they don't need, applying it to the fields. It washes out of the fields immediately, flows back into the rivers and down to the sea. This little stream is flowing right out of those rice paddies up there, and as it comes down, it's, of course, carrying all the mineral nutrients from the volcanic soil, plus all that fertilizer. I mean, all the fertilizer that wasn't needed by the farms and is just washing down. So by the time it gets here to the sea, it's like a thin nutrient soup. And so the effect is you grow simple organisms like algae, the algae that you see growing along the rocks there. And that's what we find offshore, just blanketing the coral reefs. And we only find it in places like this where you've got that kind of agricultural drainage. On the rest of the island, if there's no river carrying fertilizer, then the reefs are fine. But out there, the reefs are nearly dead. How am I doing on time? A little bit more on coral reefs? This is pretty quick.
Here we have seen
offshore.
massive colonies of tabular or table coral, these acroporid table coral, some of them the diameter of this boat, and they're in perfect health. Whereas on the mainland we also Saw some pretty large corals, but most of the large ones were dead. And so that tells us that in the past the conditions were such, the reef was healthy, and those big corals lived long enough to really grow to a substantial size. But they're not alive now, so something's changed.
And in fact, we've confirmed that those reefs are no longer growing. Most of the corals are dead. They're overgrown with large growths of fleshy algae, variety of algae. So it's a very diverse and fairly abundant growth of macroalgae, which normally would not be present on coral reefs, but now it's growing in abundance on these dead and dying reefs. And this seems to be a very strong indication that they're responding to the extra nutrients which are being delivered from the agricultural watersheds.
Right, so that's a particularly stupid problem, right? Guy Marion, Stanford undergraduate, came. We did some coral core analysis, and so you can see the green revolution happening with a stable isotopic signature showing that the algae that's killing the reefs is grown on urea rather than oceanic sources of nitrogen. So that's another unfortunate mistake. Bringing me to the end of the description of Bali's problems. I haven't time to talk about the tourists, but the tourists can be good news or bad news. We're going to try to turn them into good news. So the World Heritage, the governor said we should make the whole island a World Heritage. That's not possible. UNESCO said pick the places that are most easily defended. Remember, this is the 5th time we've tried, and turn them into the World Heritage. So here they are. So this is one of the 4. Here we have these 2 volcanic crater lakes, these forests, and then 5 guardian temples. And what I want to say to you, if you're thinking, wait a minute, maybe it would be better that the rice terraces disappeared and the forests returned, but Balinese need to eat. And these temples also have to do with maintaining the whole landscape, maintaining those forests and those lakes, as well as the rice terraces. So those temples exist. This picture is blown up here. That's where they're located, up in northern Bali. And they are guardians. They protect that sacred landscape. They call this the Uttama Mandala, the highest mandala. And it's important to all Balinese, not just the 17 villages that are located within those sites. So here's Julia again, trying to show how this, Hutan Kramat means sacred forest, how this becomes an integrated system that they're trying to maintain with the temples. Okay. So it's like managing lakes, a little more complicated. Okay? It's a coupled social ecological system in which there are attractors. I mean, the biology is pretty clear, but there are also social attractors. And it's the balance. In other words, my real take-home point, I think, is that, and this isn't the last slide, but I'm going to come to my take-home point and maybe reiterate it. If we go out into the world, if you ecologists start working with, you now work in a field in which it's assumed that you should look for non-linearities. You sort of assume that they exist. Most social scientists don't. That's news to us, right? We assume linear systems, linear equilibrium. And if you do, then you'll miss dynamics like this. And that's a problem. So here we have, I submit, rather clear evidence for a coupled system, a tightly coupled system in which there are attractors at 2 different levels. First of all, there's this nature-social world thing which creates the global attractor, the spatial scale of coordination along a river. That becomes an image of perfect order. That's an image of control that they are fully aware of, but it sets in motion the need for cooperation, which is hard to achieve in the human world. So it's that dynamic, I'm claiming, that defines the attractors simply. It's like a first pass at explaining what are the attractors for this tightly coupled social ecological system. I'm going to say one more thing, actually, before I get to the end of it, which is I suspect you may think, okay, that's interesting, exotic, that's just Bali. Bear in mind that all of this was invisible to natural scientists and social scientists. We didn't think it worked like this. And I suspect there are lots of cases like this. I bet there are nonlinear attractors all over the place that we haven't found yet. So that's why I'm happy to give this talk to you guys, because I think we need to look for them. I think there probably are attractors, there probably are dynamics like this, but we won't look for them. We won't find them until we look for them, until we know what we're doing. Okay, so with respect, I'm calling it now our LTER. Here are the guys planning. it is kind of like, I mean, because we have a monitoring and evaluation unit, studying the dynamics of this is intrinsic to the management of our World Heritage. So can I call it an LTER? I mean, it's kind of like, maybe. The job is managing it, right? Interesting thing that they do here is sometimes, this is a procession from the Master Water Temple, sometimes they send delegations to the crater lakes on other nearby islands that they consider to be neglected. If there are neglected lakes, someone should go and pay attention and make offerings. Thought. Okay. They even went to Paris and made offerings at UNESCO Paris to kind of, they were trying, you see, this was the way in which the Balinese tried to explain what they were doing to UNESCO bureaucrats by having a ritual, kind of showing them how to do it. Okay. That's what we have to explain, why would they do that? Maybe you know it, if you know now why they did that, then my talk is a success. Okay, so to conclude, it's a complex adaptive system. You know, what are the components of the system I've just described to you? Well, we've got water temples, temple festivals. He's carrying, you probably can't see him, he's got a little silver container with holy water from the Crater Lake, which has been mixed with water from the surrounds and is being distributed to the farmers in that region. It's just a guy in a white suit with a Crater Lake and a few drops of water, but that's the management system. I mean, that's the actual system. Here we have holy water moving down from the lakes to the canals to the fields, synchronized cropping. That's pretty obvious to see. I mean, that's pretty visible unlike the religious things. But then finally there's this dimension of the control of emotions, which links to their ideas about the order of the universe. That is how they make the other stuff happen. That's my story. So, thank you very much, National Science Foundation. Otherwise, none of this would have been on record.